Good evening, everyone, and welcome.
Okay.
Welcome to this month's meeting of Mystery Writers of America, New York. Our topic tonight is characters. I thought I would take a change from the expert of the month approach to having speakers and let us be the experts, and let's just have a writer's rap session on different topics. And this week on characters. And I'll start by saying that I taught for 45 years. I taught English most of that time at a university. And one thing I always talk to my literature students about and my writing students about is that stories are always about people, no matter what the story is. I think when I was teaching junior high school, we read the story "There Will Come Soft Rains" by Ray Bradbury. And if you know that story, it's about an automated house that continues to function after a nuclear war. And there's nobody left. And so the question, who were the characters in the story? The people who weren't there because of what they did to themselves. And so I hope my stories are character driven, even though I spend a great deal of time plotting, and I know you all do as well. So that's certainly something we can talk about. How do you create characters? How do you come up with characters? How do you come up with main characters, your protagonist, your antagonist? How do you come up with your supporting characters? How do you name them? What sort of things happen to make you pull something out? And the book I just finished, I was working on that. I came up with a supporting character, a very small role, but they were twins. They were the daughter of someone from Haiti, and their names were Avril and May. One had been born on April 30th before midnight, the other on May 1st after midnight. And it becomes something that, and it popped into my head. It's one of those things where you think, oh yeah, this might work, and you do it. So let's hear from some of you. What do you do with characters? How do you approach characters? Anybody want to start? Al?
I have several characters that started as just a spear carrier role to to plug a little hole, and they turned out to have, well, legs. I have a series set on the Big Island of Hawaii, kind of an ensemble cast, officers of the Hawaii County Police. And one of them is a young woman officer named Jenny Freitash, and she started out that way. And she has starred in 3 stories in Alfred Hitchcock, which I'd say she's earned her keep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I have several that came about that way.
Go ahead, Jane.
No, I have an unfinished book where I began to realize that one of the minor characters' backstory was so much more interesting than the book I was writing. Really, I'm really going to maybe use that somewhere else, but I want to build a story around him, because the story is so much more interesting. And I'm glad to hear Al say that works, that, you've been successful in that, but they take on a life of their own. And as it builds, I'm sure other people find that, right? That, as you get to know them, you find different things out about their backstory. And by the end, he was far more interesting than the protagonist, far more.
Well, that I think that can happen easily. And you can start. I mean, I put a character into my 3rd mystery novel, who had been the lead character or the lead investigator in a mystery play that I had written. I had seen, I think, 4 productions of the play, Buffalo, New York, twice in Rochester. And I thought, yeah, she's yeah, I'd seen 4 different women play the part, and I thought, yeah, I could use her. And the reason was, my publisher at the time was in disarray, and I was afraid that I might lose the series I had started, and I thought, I'll have this character so I can do a backup series. Well, she has since been the star of another mystery play, but she is a supporting character in the series I have, and she just got to be very interesting for me. And I'm going to write a couple short stories, as Al said, and she's going to be, Maxine Travis will be the lead character in those short stories.
I don't know how other readers feel, but I love it when I find a character in a different book. I love that.
And sometimes those characters can wind up having their own books later on, like you said, because, and if you look at so many TV shows that had spinoffs,
Yes.
like, as way back to is, Mary Tyler Moore and Lou Grant was a spinoff, right? But Lou was a great character. He was
Yes.
an interesting character.
Yes.
And I think you see that with Cheers and Frasier, which is two very different settings. So I do find that sometimes I don't know the character until I've written them a while, and then their voice becomes easier. But I also
think
sometimes base it on somebody I've known, right? That that teacher you knew, the coach you knew, the bus driver, the librarian where you went, the conductor on the train that's just so joyous and happy. They make happy announcements all the time, and you're like, wow, this person loves their job. They just love this. And
we'll enjoy seeing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the time I base it at least partially on somebody I know.
When you talk about spin-offs, I'm old enough to remember the Warner Brothers detective series of the late 50s and early 60s. The first was 77 Sunset Strip, and they spun off from that Bourbon Street Beat, Hawaiian Eye. What else? Bourbon Street, Hawaiian Eye, Surfside 6 in Miami. So there were 4 shows. And they were the characters interacted. They did that whole we have a universe thing. So sometimes there were crossovers that are very, very popular and common today. And but you also see crossovers in other things. In Stephen King's novel Under the Dome, Jack Reacher appears for a crossover. And it's just one of those things where he has basically a cameo, and so a character can take on a life of his own, which is absolutely true. I have a question that this came out of a discussion I had the other day. I started writing when I was 10, and I got my first baby book at 13. And I said that to somebody, and they looked at me like, "What?" I said I was writing stories. I wanted to think up names, so I got a baby book. When did you get your first baby book?
I have used because genealogy is a hobby. It peers into a lot of different interests. I have used the Social Security Administration. They put out a list of names every year, and as long as I think there's more than 3, they'll publish them, and it's amazing which names become the most common. And you could sometimes almost tell just by the names of the characters where and when it took place, right? So,
right.
Like my grandfather's middle name was Aloysius, and you don't see too many Aloysius.
And which makes it work, though, because then the character becomes memorable. When I was creating my detective Gideon Rhymes, and I'm happy to be 4 books in at this point, when I was creating him, I was looking for a name, and every name I came up with, I Googled, and there was somebody with that name. Then I came up with the name Gideon Rhymes. Googled it, nobody. And I thought, yes, I've got it, because now if somebody Googles that name, it takes them only to my stuff, my character, my stories. So that's another part of characters, finding the name that works. But one thing I have read death notices since I was a kid also, because I've been a reader of the daily newspaper my whole life. And I would read death notices and I'd see interesting names and I'd write them down. Oh, that's an interesting name. And I've probably written down many more names than I've ever used or will ever use. But it becomes a way to think. When you hear a certain name, if you hear John Smith, what do you think of? And I didn't want to give a particular name, but you hear other names. What do you think of? Okay.
I think of an everyman.
Yes.
John Smith.
Jeff, I think you're on mute. You were trying to say something?
Yeah, he's on mute. Yeah.
There you go.
There you go.
Yeah, I think when you're looking for names for characters, you almost don't really know who the character is until you find their name. And I think we find them, in some cases, the most ordinary places, and sometimes, the oddest places. But until you can call that character by his or her name, it's almost like they're a placeholder in the story, lacking the depth you want the character to have, until you find where their name is. When I was writing my series, I had a detective who became really important in one of the books. And for the longest time, he didn't have a name. And I'm writing and he's working, it's working fine in terms of the plot, but I know it's not right yet. And I'm sitting at breakfast one morning at my local diner, looking at the breakfast specials. And one of the breakfast specials that morning was Eggs Benedict, misspelled. And I looked at my wife and I said, that's it. The detective's name is Eddie Benedict. And every time my amateur sleuth goes to meet him, she calls him Detective Benedict, and he growls, my friends call me Eggs. and once I knew that, I knew everything I needed to understand who that detective was, where he was in his life, how he interacted with people, how he sounded. And it was just this momentary thing that had I not had breakfast that morning at that diner, had they not misspelled Eggs Benedict on the breakfast menu, he would have been a very different character in the story.
Yes.
Our job as authors is to sort of be open to the world around us, let that stuff sort of happen. I think we see the same things other people see, and we hear something different. We look at the same stuff everybody else is looking at, but we see something different when we're looking at it, and that's where our stories come from, our characters come from that ability or that practice of just observing the world.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. People are fun to watch.
I have a excuse me, a cute story about character names. One of my Hawaii characters is a detective named Errol Coutinho. Coutinho being a Portuguese name. Mm-hmm. Portuguese names are all over Hawaii for historical reasons. And I thought I had a unique name. I didn't find any, I Googled it, didn't find anybody. I just got an email from a young woman named Maria in the Netherlands explaining that her boyfriend's name is Errol Coutinho. His birthday's coming up, and would I make him a birthday greeting video?
Oh, that's awesome.
Oh, how nice.
That's wonderful.
So, of course, I did. I mean, she's a reader. Of course, I'm going to do it.
Sure.
That's great. Back to what Joe was saying about the Social Security database.
Mm-hmm.
You can use it in the opposite direction too, because at some point it breaks them down by state. And so you can go and make sure that if you do have an unusual name, if there was only one name that month, that year in that state, you don't want to be using that name. So if they can work in both ways, both the popular names and the rare names that you don't want to duplicate.
Right. Well, you don't want to, you don't want to name duplication. You don't want to do it in your own books, but in my series, my detective is named Gideon Rhymes, the mayor of Buffalo. The mayor of Buffalo now is Byron Brown. He's a friend of mine, but in the novels, the mayor of Buffalo is a woman named Ophelia Green. And I just read an unpublished book, finished reading it today as a favor to another author who doesn't know me, as a favor to a mutual friend. And she has a Gideon and an Ophelia in the book, which I thought, wow, that's one of those things that you want to avoid interacting and using other names or winding up with other names as much as you can, just because you want your characters to stand out. You want them to be unique. But what makes people unique?
It's interesting that you say that, because a name like Gideon gives a very different feeling, initial impression, than a name like Sam, right? And some name, I always thought that the one name that's the most flexible amongst men's names was Jack, because you be Jack the Ripper, Jack Bauer, Jack Ryan, Jack and the Beanstalk, Jack Spratt. And, Jack could be humorous, or he could be troublesome, or he could be hero.
Yes.
And it's a very flexible name. So sometimes I'll start off with Jack and then rename them later on when I don't know who they are yet.
Okay, that makes sense. And I've had that experience too, not knowing who somebody was, and I was trying a number of exotic names for this woman who's really a villain. And one day I was watching Jeopardy, and there was a woman playing, and her name was Genesis, and I thought, oh wait, that could work. So I ended up naming this character Genesis, and then ended up giving her a father named Jericho. So it was, and of course Gideon is there too. And my detective is an agnostic who quotes the Bible like his creator, and occasionally I get teased about that, but it does become source material, as does Shakespeare, as does Cervantes, and so forth.
Gary, I think you made a really important point there about when you said his father's name, because I think you have to think about who named that kid.
Yes.
And when did they name them? So I think it's important.
Yes.
The father's name fits in.
I have a question.
Yes, Marjorie.
Because we're talking about names. I have fun with names. I don't feel like I don't have a problem with them. But what the question I want to ask you all is, do you describe your characters? I mean, the clothing they wear, the height they are, all that sort of thing. Where does all of that come in? The name, I think once we get the name, we have a sort of image in our head, and the name fits our image. But my question is whether or not you actually give a description or don't give a description and let the reader work it out for themselves. I mean, how do you do that? I mean, look at all the TV stuff where they take, like they had Tom Clancy doing what, Jack Reacher. It was ridiculous.
Oh, Tom Cruise. Yeah. No, that.
And I heard Lee Charles talking about it. I went to a talk that he went to, and people were asking him about that. And so that's a whole other, probably another language to have.
I love description. I've been told by editors to cut it back, and that's okay. I'll cut it back, but I love having something visual in the because I'm a very visual reader, as well as a huge film fan. So visual images are important to me. So I try not to describe my characters too much. The extent of the description for me is how important the character is to the story. There is a person who's just mentioned in passing in there. For example, I wrote a line recently, something that my detective had been told earlier, and I wrote the line, when he met this woman, I wondered, which hip of this bird-like woman held the blue rose tattoo that had bound her husband to her, something the husband had told him. And so her only description was bird-like, because she wasn't in the story as an active character. She didn't say anything. He just got to meet her in passing. And it was a reference to a scene earlier in the book when they were talking about tattoos. So that kind of description, a single word will do it. I might, I don't want to spend too much time there, but I want to give the reader something. But then if I'm dealing with my main characters, I need more. My detective has a partner. She becomes his partner after the first book. She's a lawyer. Her name is Phoenix Trinidad. She is her father was a Puerto Rican policeman, her mother a black nurse. And in their first love scene in the first book, she explains to him that breast cancer ran in her family. Her mother died of it, her aunts, and so forth. So when she was young, she had a double mastectomy. And when she's nude, what he sees is, she changed her name from Phyllis to Phoenix, because what he sees is a huge tattoo of a phoenix rising out of the ashes. And that becomes a motif rather, that recurs, references to the tattoos.
Has changed over time. There was a time where editors would tell you every time you introduce a character, you've got to write a 2-sentence description after you introduce them so readers can visualize the character. I just went back to the first book that was published in 2004. I just went back and did a new edition, and I took out almost all of those 2-sentence descriptions because they don't serve a purpose. I think you need something to connect, to visualize, the character, but it doesn't have to be a lot. I have one character, for example, who I pictured him as a relatively large man with really small feet. But what you see is this sort of tippy guy who's not really well balanced. He doesn't stand well. He doesn't, but the only thing I tell you about him, about physically, is that he's a large man with tiny feet. The rest of it, what I want to know about a character isn't necessarily what they look like. I'll figure that out. I want to know what they think, what they believe, how they react in different kind of situations. I want to get to know the character through stuff that, at least for me, is more meaningful than physical, except when the visual allows me to do something that serves a purpose. But as I say, the first editor I worked with was like, you need 2 sentences every time you introduce a character.
Wow.
Like, I want to know what kind of dress she's wearing. I want to know, if she got a sunburn on her nose. I don't need to know that stuff. I took it all out.
I might start a character off with one detail and then add as it becomes appropriate during the story. And sometimes if you give the reader room to make an erroneous picture, it can harm the story later on. Then you have to get more detailed. But other than that.
Well, and again, you can, with a character, you give the information you need but how do we approach people? Because we all watch people. Don't deny it. We all eavesdrop. Don't deny that either. That's part of being a writer. I was on a train many years ago, and I was working on this was before the days of computers, and I had a notebook. I was sitting in a lounge car. It was one of those back and forth things to Albany, which I had to do periodically as a union rep for State University. And I was sitting across the aisle from some people who looked over at me and said, "What are you writing?" I said, "I'm working on a short story." They said, "Oh, you're a writer." That line we've all heard. Yes. And then the next line we've all heard, "Where do you get your ideas?" And I said, "Do you really want to know?" And they said, "Yes." And so I took out the second sheet of paper from the notebook, one I'd had on the side, and I started reading back to them some of the quotes they had given during their talk, because they were saying interesting things. I mean, this one guy said, well, yeah, we came out of the water and this naked guy was standing there with a machete. So we went down to another part of the beach. I'm thinking, sounds like a good plan to me. But I wrote that down and they said, you were eavesdropping. I said, that's what writers do. So we notice things about people. So if I think of the four people at the, and one of them became a friend, just to clarify, they were all City of Buffalo employees coming back from Albany, and one of them did become a friend of mine. But when they were sitting there talking, 3 men, 1 woman, the man who talked about the naked guy with the machete had the most interesting thing. So if I were going to use him as a character briefly, I would say something about him just to connect the reader to him. And it might be a gesture or a mannerism or something that would explain, because if his hands are moving around constantly, that becomes a character trait that you can certainly do something with, and you expect that later. So I do remember, like Jeff said, the various times that you read a book and you get 2 sentences of description, and sometimes 1 word will do it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even have to be an adjective. It could well be it could well be a well-chosen verb. Milton Block lumbered into the room. Well, we know something about Milton from lumbered. He's kind of big, and his name may suggest that as well. So those are all reading shortcuts that we learn to do, I think, as writers.
One of my friends who is involved in Romance Writers America, she gave a very interesting presentation about setting as a character and how we have that too. And
yes.
One of her.
It should be.
I'm sorry?
I think it should be.
Yeah. And it really can be, right? I mean, it takes on a life of its own, especially depending on the type of genre you're writing. So
Sure.
One of her books takes place at turn of the century New York, which is brutally hot, and there's a murder, and it's also male romance, and she sets New York, and you get a complete feeling for the atmosphere of what it was like at that time in New York when it's in the 90s and people are passing out and they have ice trucks going around, and
Yes.
it's
Yes.
a different New York than we live in. And she said it so well that even though I knew it historically, I saw places that I didn't know in my head, like the old Madison Square Garden, right?
Mm-hmm.
And things like that,
I think you're right. I think setting is absolutely a character, and I think setting is on the list to be talked about in a future session. But you're absolutely right. That does make it work. I mean, one of the reasons I started a mystery series, I published lots of short stories. And one of them was an historical novel that wasn't really a mystery, but takes place at turn of the century Buffalo. I loved all the old information because I've read books that are like that. I love The Alienist, for example. Wonderful details of turn of the century New York, or just before turn of the century New York. And that takes the reader to another world, which is absolutely great. Nancy, your hand went up a little bit ago, so my squares are small here on this small tablet, so please bear with me.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm writing in the first person right now, and I'm just curious how other people handle first person accounts of appearance. So this is the voice of a woman she's an unreliable narrator, but I do want to let the reader know she's alluring, but she's also self-conscious. So I had her talking about her overbite. There was never enough money to get her teeth fixed. But I'm just kind of curious how others might have handled that, the first person communicating the character.
That's a great question. Nev, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Nancy.
I know.
The first person is very interesting because you get 2 layers of information, right? You get to know a little bit about what that person is seeing, so the outside, but by the adjectives and the the attitude you put into the description, you get a lot about what the person who's narrating it is really like. So I was just going to say, when Gary was talking earlier, I think maybe and Al, that the perception, how you describe somebody, if it doesn't quite match later on, you could get into trouble, or you could set that up to be part of your clues because you have deliberately created a mismatch, right? From the way that they behave versus something that they do later on. That can be, your clue later on. The characters do have, in first person, do have to have a reason for the way they describe something. So
Keep talking. Excuse me 1 second.
no worries. Oh, he's got a call. Okay. Yeah. So I was gonna say, you have to have a reason for the way they describe something. So if they are cynical in the way they're describing people, then they have to behave cynically too, right? They have to have that continuity. They can't switch back and forth. But one other piece I was going to mention when we were talking about character naming, and I'll just quickly mention that here, is the name not only reflects the personality of the person, but also the ethnicity and the background of the person, especially if they don't go by the way that it was originally intended. A lot of European names were recharacterized later on because people were trying to normalize, trying to assimilate. And there's a lot of information there. Actually, the name gives you the backstory of the character, like someone else mentioned. So there's a lot of good stuff there. I actually did an article on learning to name characters from Dickens. It was carried by, I forget, Mystery Magazine or something, but I just love Dickens because it's got such a lot of quaint names. And I'll say one last thing is about Raymond Chandler. He puts in description into the minutest character, the giveaway, the throwaway, not even secondary, tertiary character. So I remember he talks about in the Big Sleep, I think it is, about a waiter who has evil eyes. That waiter was in 1/2 of one page, but I remember him because he had evil eyes, and it was related to the story. He didn't give him information that he needed. He has one scene where the Marlowe goes to talk to the parents of the dead girl, and the father has a habit of running his hand over his bald head all the way down and touches his knee, which is such an elaborate mannerism, and he just does that twice. But I can see the father and the mourning that's in that slow gesture. There's something very achy and sad about that slow gesture, and so now I 3 books later I still remember the old man.
That's great. Donna, your hand has been up.
Just to answer the question earlier, as far as the first person and the alluring, it would seem like one way to write it would be to have her talk about observing someone else's reaction to her, that she was doing something and she noticed that other character found her alluring. And that way she doesn't have to say, oh, I'm alluring. She could say, oh, look, he's attracted to me this way, or she's attracted to me this way.
Yeah.
Or the dog is attracted to me this way.
I've used that method, and not in the mystery genre, but in urban fantasy, I'm working on the main character is a demon, but most humans don't see him as a demon. However, he is physically imposing, and it's first person. So it's how people react to him or how animals react to him, because he's a big, imposing guy. And I use that same thing where, the other person has a wide, eyes wide open when they're looming over them. And if you use a word like loom, it usually means it's somebody pretty tall. Like Al could loom over you if he wanted to, right? So
That's absolutely true. And I apologize for my little break there. My better half had to go out, and her 92-year-old mother lives upstairs and can't be alone. And she keeps forgetting things. She forgot I was here. So she was just checking. So she's not in the house alone. I told her I would come up after the meeting, but then that becomes a way to do characters as well, because you take real people and you put them in circumstances. For example, when my father ended up going into a nursing home, my stepmother, who has always had some mental health issues, she freaked out a number of ways. But one of the things she did, we were in the activities room of this nursing home, and this was back in, well, he's been gone like 11 years now. This is back in maybe 2005, 2006. And they're sitting there. He's in his wheelchair. He's in his 80s. He has Alzheimer's. He's got a silly smile on his face, which was not him his entire life. And the quote activities girl, and she was 22, and I knew that because I heard her tell somebody her age. So to me, she was a girl anyway. The activities girl came by. How are you today, honey? And he says, all right. And she says, good. And then she walks to the center of the room where she's about to do the thing that will make you gouge your eyes out with a spoon, a sing-along. And they start within the good old summertime. Meanwhile, my stepmother is going, she called him honey right in front of me. What are you talking about? There's something going on. I said, there's nothing going on. Don't tell me this. Young women sometimes like old men. I said, yeah, but they usually have something to give them, like money or a ride in a car. What's he going to do? Take her across the activities room in his wheelchair? And ultimately then I ended up writing a play, a murder mystery that dealt with a husband with Alzheimer's and a wife with mental illness, and recreated that scene and made the character Ruthie much more terrifying. The actress who played Ruthie really put her in the first production we did. She really, but again, I saw 4 productions of that play, and everybody was good because Ruthie's kind of a scary character. But it started with something like that. I'm telling people, she thinks he's having an affair when he's in a wheelchair in diapers. This is ridiculous. But but something came out of it. Not just the idea for the story, but the idea for the characters in the story. Jane.
I don't know how many of you have read 3/5 by John Bircher, but on his, I think it's on the first page, he has like a sentence that I envy so much, because in a nutshell, he tells you what this kid is going to be like, who's the protagonist. And I wish I knew the whole sentence so I could, give it correct respect it deserves. But basically, the kid takes that cigarette out of a pack, then he gets his inhaler and he inhales, and then he lights the cigarette. And that sort of is symptomatic of how he is going to behave throughout the book. And I know others of you have probably written sentences like that. I have not. I would love to. But to me, it summarizes the character by that, sort of typical behavior they're going to demonstrate.
I suspect you probably have written that sentence, but you don't realize that you've written it because you're in the process of being close to your characters and writing the story as you see it. But every now and then, I think we get lucky with a sentence that captures who a character is, and then we may not recognize that we've done that, but there is a sentence, there is a gesture, there is something about a character that explains who that character is, and then makes that character real, not just to you, but to the reader. And that's the thing, because we're all readers. So when we're reading our stuff over, I mean, it's hard to read your own work, it's hard to edit your own work, but you have to try to approach it as a reader, because then you see how the characters are. And now I mentioned to my mother-in-law, and I go up regularly and sit and talk with her, and she's read one of my books, but she's 92. Her first language is Spanish, and she has difficulty at this point as her memory is going. But I talk to her and tell her what I'm working on, and she says, these people sound so real. And that sort of gives me a grounding, because the characters have to feel real to you as the writer if they're going to feel real to the reader. And let me ask a question. Have any of you dreamed about your characters?
Oh, all the time.
Oh, yeah.
all the time.
Really?
I'm glad to hear that.
One of the great compliments I ever got was a critique group I helped run. And one of the women said, I dreamed about your character last night, the story we were just reviewing.
Wow.
Like,
Wow.
I said,
Wow.
That's really good. I hope it was a good dream. It wasn't. It was that same demon. But I worked on the first novel, and it's not on publication, but the first novel I ever wrote is kind of a near future mystery thriller, kind of a dystopia. And one of the characters, writing new fiction is forbidden in this world, but the classics are required reading. And even as you type on your computer, because it's all cloud-based in that future, it starts to tell you whether or not you're starting to get into fiction, even in an email.
Well, that's a cool idea.
One of the characters who gets in trouble, and his lawyer's telling him, why did you do that? As I started to write him, he started to seem more and more like Truman Capote. So I based him on Truman Capote with his mannerisms and his way of doing art and all the things Capote loved to do. And not exactly flamboyant, but outgoing in the way Capote was. So I realized, oh, this is really Truman Capote I'm writing. I'm not even inventing a new character.
That is such a cool idea. But what do you do in a world where you can't create? Because what kind of character would you have for that? I don't know if we're mentioning books. I think I read this 50 years ago, The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester. It's a science fiction novel set in a world where the police can read minds. It's a little like the Philip K. Dick idea of Minority Report, but this guy gets an earworm, a song that won't leave his head, and whenever he's near a cop, he starts thinking of it because the song will confuse the mind reader. What he did was commit a murder, and the cops will know if they're near him, but he has this little song going off in his head. And that was such a beautifully wrought bit in terms of that. I used to, when I was younger and I'd go to the dentist, I would have that little song in my head, what he was saying, just because it was distracting. And I think if a character can reach out and give you a mannerism or give you an earworm or give you something, the character then is effective.
I read that book. I haven't thought about it in 50 years, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I look back a lifetime of reading. I just think there have been wonderful characters. You mentioned Dickens, Nev. First name that popped into my head was Jerry Cruncher from A Tale of Two Cities, which is one of my favorite books. And I love Jerry Cruncher because it's such a great name for a character.
Uriah Heep.
Yes, Uriah Heep.
It's 19.
I was at an Ample Hills reading the other night, the creamery that Randy Dawn runs readings there. And one of the authors was reading from a Star Trek novel he had worked on, Deep Space Nine stuff. And you get contracted for that, right? They're contracted to write.
Okay.
And he caught the characters so well. The voices were just like they are in the show. And I think it's interesting that if you write more than one story or more than one novel with the character, do you keep their voice the same? Do you keep the characterization the same? Sometimes I have to reread stuff I wrote to make sure I'm in the right voice and I'm writing the right character. Because I'm sure many of you know, you rewrite, writing is rewriting. You rewrite a novel and the character might have a different voice by the end as you're doing your rewrites, and hopefully a more interesting one. But I know I've often read my own work just to make sure I'm in that mindset when I go to do it.
I think that's absolutely necessary if you're doing a series, because you want your character to be consistent. You want your character to evolve because that's part of writing. Characters change, people change, but you but you want the character to be consistent in terms of his or her mannerisms and the things that are important. I mentioned before we got started, when we were talking, a couple of us were here, that today is my son's birthday, and I finished this fourth book today. And he says, "Oh, so you finished it for my birthday?" And in a sense, my son, who turned 39 today, is a three-tour combat veteran, and he became a police officer. And he's now deputy director of security for a defense contractor. So he doesn't need a birthday present from me. he can put me up if he needs to. But when I was creating my character had a similar backstory, and I had to go back to the original book and refer to it. And one thing that I took from my son, when he had his first firefight in Iraq, he called me on a sat phone and said, "Dad, I killed people today and I have to talk about it." And I said, "I'm here, talk." And we discussed it. And, I tried to be a good dad that day and tell him that this circumstance was beyond his control. And I ended by saying, "If you have the same thing tomorrow, I want you to do exactly the same thing. I'm sorry for other people's losses, but you're my son and I want you home." And I recreated that in the first novel, where my detective, who was raised by a godfather, had the same thing happen. He's not comfortable with the idea of taking life. So he referred to that event when he was in combat. And then in the most recent book, there's a line that he reacts to another name being added to the ledger that formed after he had his first experience in combat, and it unsettles him. And that becomes something that's going to continue through the books, because he shouldn't get comfortable with, even in self-defense, with something that happens like that. He shouldn't get comfortable with it, and that's part of his personality. And I go back and I check the first book religiously, going back. Let's see, this is what he felt about this. This was the car. This was whatever other detail. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, did he have a second bedroom in his apartment? And I went back and looked, and he didn't have a second. There was no mention of a second bedroom. So when I needed a second bedroom, I could put one in. So you do have to go back, I think, to keep your character consistent. And I know Raymond Chandler, Marlowe in the novels bounces around in age quite a bit. He's a certain age in one book and another, and it's like the fictional character gets to a point where they step out of the time stream, and that makes, that's what you want the character to do. If the character is going to be long term, they step out of the time stream and they become something else. So
I didn't do that. My first series character is a prostitute sex worker named Diana Andrews, and I started writing her in 2000. I had no idea she was going to go on for 20 years, and I wrote her in real time. So she's now 52, out of the business and doing other things. But and I'm not the only one. Michael Connolly did that with Harry Bosch.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Who's getting on 70 now, I think.
Yeah, he'd have to be.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, the one place people don't age is too much is comic books.
Yeah, but
It takes a long time to go from 18 to 25, like Spider-Man.
yeah, no, comic books are they're their own special. They have their own special devices for that. When we talk about multiverses and all this other stuff people come up with to try to make things consistent, and they should just accept there is no consistency to any of that. I read an Ace Atkins Spencer novel, and that was Spencer has moved into that territory where he is outside of time, so to speak, because although there was a funny bit in that, we talk about character. Somebody in the book made a reference to Mark Wahlberg making a movie, and Adkins had a line. I had Spencer, or was it Spencer? Somebody gave the line saying, "I hope it was better than his last one." And of course, if you watched Spencer Confidential on Netflix, you probably had your air conditioner being powered by Bob Parker spinning around in his grave by Mark Wahlberg as Spencer, and it just didn't work. And that becomes a subtle reference too. But
You know, that's interesting, Gary, because if you look at some of the most iconic characters we have, Holmes has mostly been played pretty similarly between the different actors, you know, with the exceptions of the variants, right? Like Elementary and Sherlock and things. But I mean the true Holmes. Whereas somebody like James Bond actually is quite different between the different Bonds.
Yes, absolutely.
And Roger Moore is not much like the latest Bond, Craig.
Daniel Craig, yeah.
And sometimes you go and say, well, I can actually see this character I've read in books as either one of these, even though they're not the exact same as the book characters.
That's again, that's one of those things where the character steps out of time, because then you if you read any of the continuation novels in the Bond series, you'll find that for the most part they're less like Fleming in the writing and other stuff, and more like the Bond in the movies. Whereas Anthony Horowitz, and I've read Trigger Mortis and Forever and a Day, which were, and I think he has another one coming out. They're Bond novels that are situated inside Fleming's canon. He has access to Fleming's notes and story ideas, and he's employed some of those. And he writes like Fleming, which is kind of remarkable, because John Gardner didn't, for example. So
we get this with Poirot too.
Yeah, I have not read his Poirot, but yeah.
But even the actors, the Peter Ustinov versus the David Suchet versus now the latest one, which I haven't seen yet, with
Kenneth Branagh.
and Albert Finney did it, right? In Murder on the Orient Express.
And I loved Albert Finney's portrayal. You know, at the time that movie came out, I was very heavily into Poirot, and I loved him as a character, and I thought Finney captured him beautifully. I was less impressed with Peter Ustinov, but you know, it's when characters make a transition to immortality, it becomes harder to nail them down.
Yeah.
Gary, I have a question.
Yes.
Open to anyone who wants to answer, of course. So each book has a character arc for your main character, and you want them to have moved, right? There should be some movement there. So if we're trying to preserve the characteristics of that individual in the next book and the following book, doesn't it feel a little bit like we would get repetitious? Should they have new challenges? Should we keep some things constant and move them to new problems? I've tried to figure out, how do we keep the character still interesting, but have attained that growth from the previous book, so it's not a repetition?
That's an excellent question.
You know, I really think that depends, because if you look at some of Agatha Christie stuff, it's each circumstance is unique for Poirot, right? And very much Tom Clancy is like that, in that Jack Ryan's in a lot of the books, but Red October is nothing like Sum of All Fears, and nothing like Clear and Present Danger. So that character is driven into these different scenarios. Of course, I don't think you want to go on vacation anywhere Jessica Fletcher or Poirot are, because the chances of survival are much slimmer. But I think you can do that by keeping some of the same, but change the setting the character's in. And of course, some series, authors, especially in a romance, they basically redo their same story over and over again with different characters, different setting, and the readers love it. They can't get enough.
So this is the
I
problem
would.
with Christie. Agatha Christie, I don't think has much character growth for Poirot. Maybe some of the more recent stuff might have, build like Poirot's Last Case actually has some of his own backstory. But you could pick up any of her, I don't know, 66 books, maybe 30 were Poirot's, and the Poirot could be interchangeable with the other Poirot.
Yeah.
He
So I
doesn't
think
change.
what she does is she changes the scenery rather than change the character. So the Orient Express versus, Death in the Nile versus Evil Under the Sun, you have different locations.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think the other thing that happens that that Christie did get to with Curtin was the infirmities of age. And we age. We simply can't help aging, and it becomes a point where the characters change, where you can mention, even though fictional characters age more slowly than other people, you can certainly have your character develop insights about aging, because as it happens, we all do. And I mean, I've been a kid my whole life. My ex-wife referred to me as perpetually 11, and her successor says pretty much the same thing. and I've just bounced around in relatively good health and so forth. Then I turned 70, and my body said, "Okay, I'm done." And I've had all kinds of difficulties with that, as my friend Dwayne said, and we go back to 4th grade, and he some years ago had a heart transplant, and then in 2020 lost his wife to COVID, even though he survived it in the wake of a heart transplant. And we were talking one day, and he said, "Golden years, my ass." We all pick up stuff about aging, and that becomes part of character growth. It becomes part of my growth that that I can't move the way I used to move. And that's something that can be dealt with in terms of character development. There are things that happen. There are things that characters learn from one book to another that could make a difference if you're having your characters age. Now, Al, you mentioned your character who's now 52 and who started as a prostitute. Well, obviously she has evolved, and so we can evolve even as we remain younger. And there's a part of me that thinks I'm still 40 and would love to still be 40. What was it? I retired 8 years ago from the University of Buffalo, and then I was cleaning out my office and I found a picture. I was retiring at 62. And then I've taught 5 years additionally. So if you're working on math, and I found a picture from graduation when I was like 41, 42. And I looked at the picture and said, "Wow, look at that. 20 years younger, 20 pounds lighter, black hair. I want that guy back." Because in my head, I'm still that guy. My body is telling me I'm not. And so your character can learn to deal with the difficulties of the aging process or loss, because we had a brief discussion at a board meeting some time ago. Al may remember, where we were talking about the pandemic and whether it would find its way into books. And the book I was writing on then, which I just finished working on then, deals with the pandemic. Not because it's a pandemic novel, it really isn't, but it takes place during the pandemic. And some of the characters I've had in the series die. And like one of my detective's closest friends dies early on, and it affects him greatly. So there's an evolution that will come from our loss as well. And then I found a way to the pandemic could be used to mask a murder. And I'm not going to reveal that yet, because the book just went to my editor today. But you find that your characters are affected by the same things all of us are affected by, and that gives them the ring of truth, the ring of actuality when people are reading about them.
You know,
I
that
have a quick-
last, go ahead.
Yeah, why does the character have to have a character arc? I have never understood that. Who made that up? There are lots of books where they don't have it. I mean, I don't understand why it has to be.
Well, it doesn't have to. I mean, it's been pointed out that Reacher doesn't change,
Yeah.
but it's a way to keep the
But
character.
it's the rules you read about. I don't,
Yeah.
that every book has to have this character arc. I
I
mean,
don't think it's a
either
rule. It just keeps.
either happens or doesn't happen as part of the story. But I don't think it's something you have to always build in. I don't. see
Well,
that.
that's an interesting question, in that again, if I think about classic literature, I think about the Odyssey and you know,
People
what
don't
char-
change.
right. Well, you know, you
we
come
are,
back
we
from
do.
a war, and you butcher your wife's suitors. It's like you've learned nothing about the value of life in that process. Mally?
You know, I think part of the issue is, especially if you have an amateur sleuth, and first you have to answer that question: why is somebody like us running toward the dead body instead of away?
Yeah, but that doesn't have.
So the character arc is, you know, this crime is going to change them. But once you've
Why?
done that once in the first book, what do you do with the second? You know, they're
Yeah,
still an amateur. They still have to do something that's unnatural and run toward violence. And I'm trying to write a series, so I'm grappling with the same kind of question. But one of my favorite authors is Louise Penny, and she either throws a family complication, and usually a family complication and a professional complication in Armand Gamache's way. So I don't
And
have.
he
an
is a
answer
wonderful
for you, but
character.
I feel your pain.
I think part of your character is how does your character see himself or herself? How does the character relate to the world? In one of my books, my character's godfather tells him, it's in the third book, Nickel City Storm Warning, which is about a white supremacist group attacking a diversity convention. And his godfather tells him at one point, I have gone to so many memorial services where the priest introduces the rabbi, who introduces the imam, who introduces the Presbyterian minister, and they all talk about being better than this by following some aspect of God's plan that doesn't involve butchery. He says, but all those meetings, all those events always have armed guards, people who are there who must intervene if necessary, and you are one of those people. And that becomes, how does the character see himself? How does that character, you know, what role does he have? You know, there was the commercial for the new Death on the Nile had a funny line. It said, he accuses everyone of murder. Well, yes, that is a problem because that becomes a trope for that character who says it could be you doing it this way, this way, this way. And but the thing is, how does the character see him or herself? The character.
Yeah, but that doesn't make a character arc. That's just how he sees himself. Does that have to change by the
Well,
end?
it doesn't have to change. I think it the kind of thing where if the character develops an insight, the character arc in a series may be smaller because his personality will remain consistent, but an insight into himself.
In other words, you're saying you have to have a character arc. I asked a question.
Yeah, and
You're saying
I'm not saying they have to have an arc, but characters change because people change. And how does the change go? That becomes the question, I think. How does your character change? Because your character seems more realistic if he or she evolves. But then sometimes we we don't want the character to evolve. That's who we are as readers and as consumers of stories. The oh God, what was a Star Trek 6, the movie? Kirk and Bones are in a prison, on a prison planet somewhere, and the attractive alien played by Iman comes up and makes a move on Kirk and then kisses him, and Bones says, "What is it with you?" And we all start laughing because, and my ex-wife and I, we when we watched Star Trek when we were young, when it was, you know, in its first syndication, we used to joke, "Oh, here goes Space Stud," because he's at it again. But what is it with you? We want that particular, the comfort maybe of that part of the character. But that doesn't mean the character doesn't have insights and develop and change in other ways. Or if you think about the people you know and how consistent they are, I'm fond of saying people don't change in terms of radical changes. They change in little ways.
And I think you also see sometimes
don't
the
know.
author doesn't change the character, but reveals more about them that you didn't know, right? So we find out what their motivation is, or maybe we had a slightly small false impression of what they were about. And
I
there's
think that makes sense to me, but I mean, the idea one has to have this.
yeah, I don't know that it has to have an arc, but you almost always want something to be revealed. And one of the interesting ones,
I like that.
and I don't remember if it's in the books or not, but one of the interesting ones was Nero Wolfe, the series. With Timothy Hutton. And Nero Wolfe goes out and he comes back in, I think because he brought something for a young girl, and Archie's just fascinated that he was out at all. But we
Well,
reveal
Archie, that's so brilliantly written anyway. That
and he didn't change, but he revealed something about himself that he actually does have a tender heart behind it all.
that's a very good answer. Thank you. I like that. I like that answer. I think it makes the book interesting if if the character reveals more about himself. But that's a different idea than an arc, which means a change. He probably always had that, maybe it didn't come out. I like that.
Right.
Thank
And I think that's true.
That's a pretty good answer.
We some of the comments on the side, I'd like to, if you haven't read them, June wrote, I think the protagonist has to lose something and learn something. And I think that's true too. That's one way our characters develop. We will be consistent, but we will learn something. We will, if you think of your own life and lessons you learn in your own life, you can give your character something that will make him or her say, "I'll never do that again," because we've all had that moment, right? And you're all thinking right now about that thing that you said, "I'll never do that again."
And what's fascinating is about
That's not exactly the same thing. That's not what he
if you
said.
look at Sherlock Holmes, the time he pretends to be sick and dying, he doesn't want Watson to come near him, and he dismisses Watson's medical skills.
Right.
And then later on, and you really believe that Holmes could be that way. But later on, he reveals to Watson that in truth, he really respects his skills, and he would have known that Holmes was faking if he got too close. And you see the relationship between them. He was willing to insult his friend.
It's a revelation. It's a revelation to the reader.
Willing to insult his friend very directly, his purpose for solving the crime, but also winds up telling him later that he does respect his medical skills.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that if he hadn't written it with him apologizing to Watson, we could still believe that's Holmes' voice, because of how kind of arrogant he is, right? So
yeah.
And then we find out, no, he's actually felt badly about it, but it was part of the need because he didn't want Watson to reveal that he wasn't dying.
But I like that. I like that the revelation of what's inside someone. People don't change, but you could reveal something that's interesting. You don't have to.
Come on in, Ramona.
Interesting kind of.
Yes. Hold on 1 second. Ramona, come on in. You're gonna go to bed? Okay. All right. Are you all right? Okay. My meeting is still going on, so all right, good. All right, good night. So, looking comments here. We learn what and this also is from June, we learn what my first person protagonist looks like by how others react to her. Others have to raise their chin to look at her when she looks in a mirror, or that people see her looking like her mother. Okay. Yeah, we have those things that, and in terms of first person narration, where the person can reveal something about himself. I was doing a writing workshop once, and somebody said, what was the line? I turned red, or I reddened. And when we were talking about it, I said, how do you know? And she said, well, that's what happens when you get embarrassed or what have you. I said, but your character is not looking in a mirror. So how do you know? And she said, oh, well, how could the character? I said, because the character might feel a flush of heat in her cheeks. Then the reader gets the same idea. So first person narration does become tricky with some of that. It's about 10 after 7, so we can start to wind this down. We've done these from like 6 to 7 or 6 to 7:30. So other comments before we start wrapping up? Any ideas? Or
yeah, just one quick one. I get the best names or ideas for names by watching the credits of movies.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Nev, I don't know. Nev, are you married?
Yes.
Does your husband say what Tammy says to me? I'll see you out in the lobby.
No, we're watching at home. I just keep pausing and reading them aloud.
Yes, I know. I read the
doesn't know
credits.
why.
Yes, I read the credits. I love reading credits. Yes, and somebody said, "Well, why would you?" I said, "Because if somebody worked on the film, deserves to have his name read somewhere in there." So I try to read the credits. Sometimes they're a little too fast, but
yeah, I pause them because I try to figure out the ethnicity just from the name. And frequently you can, you can, but when I can't figure it out, then I write it down and I look it up.
I'll tell you, my best friend, we call him Joe, but his real name is Jose Peng.
Okay.
I love the names like that.
And he's half Chinese and half Filipino, and is from Philippines originally. And you get those Spanish names of a lot of Chinese. His dad was Juanito Peng, right? So.
Which is a great character name, if not for a person. I mean, yeah, it's because you want names to be memorable.
But my dad was a motion picture cameraman, and you don't see him in credits because they didn't credit everybody back then. And
yeah.
Now you see I didn't even realize, even though he had told me about some of the big movies he worked on, how many people are on a set and how much goes into making a movie. Like literally hours are spent for 30 seconds on the screen,
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true.
2 cars screeching together and Spencer jumps out and runs across the street. That's the whole scene. And it's a huge setup all day long.
June, are you okay?
But regarding that first person, some people like Watson and Holmes, you bring in Watson, so Holmes has somebody to explain to, so you know what's going on. And that's why I heard Robin was invented in Batman and Robin, because otherwise Batman was sitting in the Batcave talking to no one.
Well, actually, the real invention of Robin, and I happen to know this because when I was a professor, one of my areas of expertise for papers and such was popular culture, and I did a lot with comics. The idea behind Robin was to create somebody younger readers could identify with, so younger people would buy the book as well. And then, of course, Frederick Wortham had a field day with that later, talking about implications of homosexuality in his book that trashed comics and led to the Comics Code Authority. But that got to be a thing. And Stan Lee, bless him, hated teenage sidekicks because it was a ridiculous idea. And so yeah, I think the idea of, well, I love Watson. He is my my favorite first person limited narrator. Because whenever I taught lit classes, or when I taught writing classes, and I looked at 6 kinds of narration, and I would say first person limited, the character who's telling the story is not the main character. He's there to represent you so you can watch the main character. And the best example of that is Dr. Watson and Sherlock Holmes. And everybody got that. It didn't require a lot of explanation. They all understood the reference. And but you're right. I mean, Holmes has been fairly consistent as a character, ranging from egotistical to insufferable to absolutely brilliant. And it's one of those things, just in point of, this is, my phone's going off again, the difficulties of aging. It's time for my heart pill.
I've been there, done that.
When Sherlock Holmes is the most performed fictional character ever. More actors have played Sherlock Holmes, stage, screen, and television, radio, than anybody else. And the second most performed fictional character is Dracula.
I had no idea.
Yeah, it's just and the most performed non-fictional character is Lincoln. So I'm not sure what that says. We have a monster. We have a narcissist who is brilliant, and we have a president. So I think that says something about the nature of character, though, because if we think about the characters who are performed most often for a reason. There is something about them that captures the imagination of the reader or the viewer, so that we get to identify with something. And we appreciate, and this is something for writing series, we appreciate coming back to familiar characters. We don't have to understand stuff for that. I mean, for example, I was watching the James Bond movie, The Living Daylights, with my dad many years ago. And if you remember the teaser of that, is a military exercise on Gibraltar, and a spy gets in and kills some people, and Bond stops him, but he's in a parachute that's on fire, so he manages to land on top of a yacht. And the woman on the yacht is saying, "This is so boring. This place has so many playboys. I wish a real man would show up." And my dad, who didn't like James Bond the first time he saw him, was sitting here with me and said, "Well, you're about to see one now." And Bond flips down and lands on the yacht. And it's sort of, I mean, we find comfort, I think, in characters. And we find them in familiar characters, but we can also find comfort in characters we see only a couple times. So, but let's wrap up here. Thank you for coming. And next month, and I don't have the sheet in front of me, I forget what we're talking about next month, but we'll be talking about something, and
We'll
that'll
figure
be
it out.
it'll be the night before I get surgery, so I'll probably be a nervous wreck, but we'll do it.
Oh, geez.
Good luck with the surgery.
Thank you. Good night, everyone, and thank
Good
you
night.
for being a part of Mystery Writers of America, New York. Take care.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.